So we thank you again for being with us today, and we thank you for your dedication to your growth, to your spiritual growth, to opening yourself up to different ideas and being willing to take things and kind of turn them around and look at them from different angles, from different views, from the top, from the sides, from the bottom, and really ask yourself, and we ask ourselves, well, how do I know what I know? How do I know that what I believe to be true is really true? You know? And Emerson said that, we can't take anybody else's word for it. We have to find out for ourselves. We have to make up our own mind. We have to know, and we have to understand why we know, not just because we read it or we heard it or somebody told us, but why? Why is that so? It's kind of a journey that we're on, kind of a quest, and really what we're trying to do is we're trying to discover our soul. We're trying to discover the truth. We're trying to discover the presence of the divine that is within us. In the tales of the Knights of the Round Table, when I was a kid growing up, there was very romantic ideas, that the young boys would make little wooden swords and have sword fights and all of these things, pretending to be knights and to be chivalrous and all this. And of course, we really didn't understand a thing about what those stories were about. But our impression of them came from the comic books that we read and the things that we might have seen on television or in the movies. We understood the story. But we didn't understand the truth. So this week I was reading a piece in the news, and it just kind of caught my attention because, as many of you know, I'm very interested in historical documentaries and making historical documentaries. And there was the headline was something to the effect that when we know the story, sometimes it keeps us from knowing the facts. And I thought, that's interesting. That's really interesting. And I wanted to look into that further. And the gentleman who wrote it was not necessarily a history professor. He was a professor in some other discipline, but he was a fiction writer. And what he was pointing out in the article is that our psyche, our collective consciousness, if you want to call it that, the way that we human beings, the way our culture and our society is put together, we have come to expect things to be told to us in narration, in a story form. And of course, this may go back to before things were written down, before printing presses were readily available, and the way that things were communicated was in storytelling, and the teachers of old told parables. And the reason for that is that the image that the parable creates stays with the person, long after the words are gone. Vernon Howard, in his book I think it's called Psychopictometry, talks about the power of images. That words kind of get stuck in processing. We kind of think about, what does this mean? What does that mean? But the image gets through, and the image stays with us. Some of the books that I've read about trained memory techniques, how to develop a disciplined memory where you can remember virtually anything, tell us that the brain actually works in pictures. And the way that you remember things is you create a very funny, exaggerated picture that associates this new thing that you want to learn with something old. Just as complete side note, the orators in ancient Rome, the way that they remembered things was they associated the first part of their talk with something in the entranceway of their house. So if they opened the door to the house and there was a little table on the side and there was a vase with some flowers in it, they would somehow create an image that tied the first idea of their talk to that vase with the flowers. And it stays with us today because people start off and they'll start off their talk and they'll say, well, in the first place. And the orators were literally taking a mental tour through their house, and they would start in the first place. So the idea then is that the pictures, the images, might be the way that our consciousness works, and it's more important than the words that we hear. And the stories kind of create pictures in our heads. They kind of create images in our head, you know. I think one of the great things about reading a work of fiction as opposed to seeing it on the screen is that when we read, we create the characters in our mind. You know, we read the author's words, but then we create an image. We create an image. And we have a face that goes with the character, and we have colors that go with character, color of their clothes. We might even have the smell. You know, if this is somebody who works outdoors or they work near the fire, we might smell the smoke and those kind of things. So we create all of this in our imagination. And then what happens is a screenwriter somewhere is given the arduous task of taking this book and turning it into something for the visual arts, and it comes up on the screen, and we watch it and we say, well, that's, you know, no, that's not the way that person looks. They're totally different, you know, or maybe they'll have the setting of the farm where the story took place, and we'll look at the way that they depicted it in the movie. No, the barn was much closer to the house, and you know, we have these images in our heads. And what the professor was saying is that we become accustomed to the story, and we become accustomed to getting things communicated to us in a narrative, in a story format that we are accustomed to. And then we believe the story. The story has become our truth. And later on, if we're presented with facts that do not agree with our story, we dismiss them. You know, that can't be true. It doesn't agree with the story that's in my head. And I'll just give you one example. In 1967, director John Sturges made his second movie about Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral. And he had made one once before, I guess Kirk Lancaster was in it, and somebody else, and it was the typical story, you know. Now, for those who kind of grew up in the 50s, we had these stories of Wyatt Earp from these older movies, and then you had the TV show with Hugh O'Brien, and you had Wyatt Earp, and you had all of these comic books. We used to read classic comic books when we were kids, and Western comic books, and they had all of these fictitious stories about Wyatt Earp. And as kids, we read that, and we watched the movies, and we watched the TV, and we thought, well, you know, yes, we know everything there is to know about Wyatt Earp. We've seen it on TV. We've read it in our comic books. It must be so. That's the way that it is. So in 1967, Sturges, who had made the first film, which was not historically accurate, decided that he was going to do a remake. This is with James Garner, and it's called The Hour of the Gun. And I think it's one of the best performances, I think, of James Garner in a movie. And Sturges wanted to tell the story more historically accurately than the first one. And two things happened. One is he couldn't. He couldn't, because the real story didn't have a Hollywood ending. The real story just kind of ended with the bad guy rode away and went down to Mexico and was killed by somebody down there. And of course that didn't provide a great resolution to a movie. So even though Sturges told most of the movie historically accurate, which was greatly different than the romanticized tales that we grew up with, in the end he had to create this fictitious gunfight between Wyatt Earp and Ike Clanton down in Mexico. Never happened. Historically never happened. In the movie it happened. So in the end he had to give in to the constraints of trying to tell a story in a format, in a construct that people demanded. People expect their stories to be told to them a certain way. And of course the second thing that happened was the critics panned the movie. You know, and in fact one of them said, well, this is ridiculous. They tried to be historically accurate, and this is just a movie. This is just a movie. So what happened there is we in our society, we in our culture, we have come to expect that our stories are given to us in a certain way, a certain format, a certain story arc, if you want to call it that. I read a book one time called Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters, and Aristotle kind of analyzed drama and comedy in his time, and he laid out the characteristics. And his work on drama survived, but the one on comedy is lost to history. But Aristotle pointed it out that, and keep in mind he's coming from the Western culture, the Greek culture, that there's a certain format that the story is told in. So if it's a drama, it moves forward by action, whereas comedies move forward by meeting unlikely characters, unique characters. But the drama moves forward by action. And in the first 10 minutes of the movie, for example, if it's a film, we find out who the protagonist is and what it is that they want out of life at that moment. What is the thing that they want most? And then 10 minutes into the movie, the first plot point occurs, something happens. There's an incident, and that incident takes the protagonist away from the thing that they just told us in the beginning of the movie. They just told us, this is what this person wants more than anything. And then something happens. And then something else happens, and then something else happens. And each time something happens, each time there's an incident, the protagonist gets carried further and further away from the very thing that they wanted. Until the movie reaches a peak where either the hero has to win or has to lose. There can be no other way. And everything's been getting progressively worse to where we finally think there's no way they're going to get out of this. And then somehow, miraculously, they do. And the last 10 minutes of the movie is spent kind of tying up loose ends. You know? I mean, think of every cop movie you've ever seen. It starts out with there's an old cop who's getting ready to retire that day. And in the first 10 minutes, we find out that, oh, what he's looking forward to is, you know, cleaning off his desk and going down to Florida and buying a sailboat and just spending the rest of his life just sailing off into the sunset and fishing and having a good old life, you know. And then, of course, then the call comes into the station house. There's some kind of terrible event, and he and his partner go out, you know. So this whole movie, you know, all this guy wanted to do was work the rest of the day so he could retire. But in this whole movie, he gets dragged further and further away. So the point is, we have become accustomed to having our stories told to us in a certain way in our culture, and other cultures different ways. Sometimes in movies they shoot different endings for the movies because other cultures want a different ending. We want a happy ending. Other cultures want a sad ending. And if you're interested, kind of look on the internet for the 7 basic plots of stories. There's pretty much 7 stories that get told over and over and over and over again, over and over. And we come to expect our stories to be told in a certain way. And when the stories are told over and over and over, we believe the story. And we don't necessarily accept the facts. We don't accept the facts. When I was working a few years ago on the documentary about the U-85, the German U-boat sunk off of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, I was helping Brian Jones with that. And everywhere we would go, every place we would go when we would try to read something about this incident, it had the same story in there. It had the same story. The submarine was close to shore because it was trying to land men dressed in American clothes with American money in their pockets, and they were going to sneak ashore, and they were going to be saboteurs. Almost everything we read had that. Turned out to be completely untrue. No truth to it whatsoever. Brian went up to the National Archives up in College Park, Maryland, and read the reports from the people, the intelligence officers who examined the crew. Never happened. But it's a myth, see? And it's built into It's built into the story about that submarine. And if you try to tell people that didn't happen, they'll say, oh, yes, it did. Yes, it did happen. It did happen. Now, what does this have to do with our spiritual growth? So as I was reading this article, where the professor is saying, sometimes we get so hung up in believing the story because the story fits the pattern that we have become accustomed to for a story. Sometimes we can't discern the truth when we see the truth. And then I suddenly realized, oh my goodness, that's the same for our life. That is the same for our spiritual life. It is the same for our growth here on earth. See, we all have stories. We all have stories. And sometimes we tell those stories so many times that we believe them. We believe that we are the character in the story. We believe that that is the truth about who and what we are. And after we've told the story so many times, whether we tell it to others or whether we retell it in our head to ourselves, we become identified with that. And some of the teachers say the only sin is identification. The only sin is unconsciousness. We are not conscious of who and what we truly are. We identify with these false ideas. We identify with these stories, and these stories have come together because they sound good, because they fit the right format, because they explain things in a manner that we want things explained to us. But they are not necessarily the truth. They are only the story that we have created in our head. We have to understand that different people seeing the same event all create different stories in their heads of the same event. They look at the same thing and they see something different. And they remember something different. And they tell something different. And one of the local TV stations just did it again. The TV stations have been doing this at least once a year for as long as I can remember. Where they'll have an audience, like in a little conference, people are supposed to be at a lecture or something, they're sitting there in little straight back chairs, and there's somebody in the front of the room, and they're talking, and all of a sudden, a character enters the front of the room and does something outrageous. In the example they did on a TV show, I think it was Oprah, many years ago, the person came in the room and grabbed a purse and ran out of the room, supposedly snatched a purse from one of the ladies who was in the front row, who was a Confederate. She was in on the whole thing. She was an actress that was put there to play that role. So this person comes in, grabs the purse, turns around, and runs out the door. And then they start to ask people, describe that person who just came in the room. And if there's 50 people telling what they saw, you've got about 40 different versions of what that person looked like. Some say short, some say tall, some say fat, some say skinny, some say wearing a jacket, some say wearing a sweatshirt. And of course the purpose of the TV is ratings, but it's telling you, eyewitness testimony is not reliable. Eyewitness testimony is not reliable. Everybody created a different story. And in many cases, people saw what they expected to see. They had a pre-existing idea of what someone who would come in and steal a purse looked like. And they projected that onto the person who actually came in the room. Of course, at the end, they bring the perpetrator back in, and everybody looks and they're amazed at how wrong they were. But my point is, everybody had a different story. And what they thought they saw was not necessarily what they saw. And what they saw was a performance. was something that wasn't real to start with. It was just some actors acting out a role. So what happens to us? What happens to us as we enter this world? You know, can you imagine if you could go back now and be as aware as you are now when you were born? Can you imagine? Maybe you were, and we just don't remember it. I don't know. Can you imagine trying to figure out what in the world is going on here? You know, what is this place? You know, who are all these people looking at me? What are all these bright lights? You know, what are these smells going on around here? What in the world is going on? You know, have you ever been there when a baby's born, and you know, as soon as it's born, they kind of take it away, and then they clean it up, and they're rolling it all around, and they're putting clothes on it. They put those little hats on them and everything, you know, and the poor little one is just crying his lungs out, and they're all saying, well, that's good, you know, it'll help him breathe, you know. And can you imagine what it be to go like if we were completely aware of what was going on? What story would we tell ourselves about that? Who are these people? Who are these people? Why are they doing these things to me? Do they intend to hurt me? Have I done something wrong? What is going on? So we may not remember doing that when we were first born, but I think if we go back in memory, you can see that through our whole lives we have been doing that. Through our whole lives we have been observing what's going on. We have been trying to figure out what it means. We've been assigning a meaning to it. And we have been creating a story about that. And in that story, contained in that story, is our idea of who we are. Our idea of what we are. Now what happens when we get entangled with our stories? We have to try to keep living our lives as if they're true. Nobody likes to go back and say, well, you know, that story that I've been telling for all these years, I just found out it's not true. It's not true at all. We don't like to do that. Human beings, we like to be right. So we try to go through life pretending, if we have to. We try to go through life recreating the situations that then reinforce for us the validity of our stories. I always knew it was going to be like that. I always knew, you know, yep, I've been saying it all along. Yep, it is. And of course it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy, just like the people who looked at the purse snatcher and saw what they thought a purse snatcher ought to look like. You know, we tend to go into that into that filter bubble they're talking about on the internet now. We tend to let in the information that supports what we believe. We tend to exclude information that doesn't agree. And what we have to learn to do, if we are to grow spiritually, is we have to be willing to let go of that story, whatever that story is. And there's a bunch of them. We've got stories for everything stored up in our head. And we have to be willing to let them go if we are to discover who and what we truly are. Because who and what we truly are is not in those stories. Those are our impressions. Those are what we created. And this is very, very hard for many people. We become very vested in these things. And we don't want to give them up. We don't want to give them up. We believe that they have created our identity. You know, I can't help but be any way that I am now because of where I was when. And fill in the blank. You know, everybody fills in the blank differently. But when I grew up, this happened. Or when I grew up, my parents this. Or when I grew up, my neighbors that. And we have all of these different things. And we come to say, I can't move beyond my story. I can't move beyond that. It defined me. It shaped me. It made me who I am. And I can't let go of it. And the sad truth is we have to let go of it. Good stories, bad stories, indifferent stories, all stories. They're just stories. Maybe if I put it this way, maybe it'll kind of have some lights go off. However old you are now, however old you are, you have spent 1/3 of that time asleep. And of that time that you have been asleep, you have spent a significant portion of that sleep time dreaming. Now, you probably don't remember most of those dreams. Most of us get up in the morning and we might remember a snippet of a dream here and there. But we don't hang on to them, you know. Sometimes we do remember. Sometimes we get confused, you know. I had a dream the other night that the car was out of gas, and I went and got in the car and I looked at the needle, and the car was full. You know, I'm thinking, well, who filled the car up? The car was just empty. Oh, that was a dream. I was driving it in a dream. So sometimes what occurs in the dream, because when we are dreaming it, it is absolutely real. We believe that story to be the truth. But when we awaken, we let it go. We don't hang on to it. You know, can you imagine saying, well, I dreamt last night that I was in the Army, so now I have to go enlist because I dreamt last night I was in the Army, and that's who I am. That's defines me. That's my destiny. No, it was only a story. You see? It was only a story. Something that was all made up. So if we are to grow, if we are to move through life, we have to be willing to go back and say to ourselves, everything that I thought I knew about myself may be wrong. Maybe just a story. Maybe something that was my perception of an event that happened a long, long time ago, and I assigned a deep meaning to it, and I've been living my life out of that deeper meaning, you know. But now it is time for me to find out who I really am. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And as I mentioned last week, you know, part of it is mindfulness. We have to become aware of the chatter in our brain. We have to become aware when we're living our stories. We have to become aware when our present activities are being driven from something that happened a long, long time ago that has nothing to do with what's going on here today. Many years ago, I was reading a book on psychology and hypnosis, and the author gave an example of someone who came to him that had a terrible cough. They had a terrible cough their whole life, and the doctors could find no medical reason for the cough. So they sent this patient to the psychologist, and the psychologist was able, through hypnosis, to have the patient go back to when the cough started, to remember. And it was many, many years ago, and they were a child, and they were very, very sick. And in those days, the doctors would make house calls, and the doctor came to the child's room and examined him, and then went out into the hall to talk to the parents. And the doctor expected the child to die. And the doctor said to the parents, he's never going to get over this. And by that, the doctor meant the child's going to die. Well, the child didn't die. The child got better. But part of him accepted that story of he'll never get over this as his truth, that he always had to have that cough. And he carried that cough with him into adulthood. And the psychologist was able to break that, to break that association, to break that identification. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We have all of these different ideas that people have told us about who we are and what our relationship to this thing called God is, and all of that. And at some point we've got to say, none of that may be true. None of that may be true. I have to go in and I have to find out now who I am. I have to be willing to let go of the good. I have to be willing to let go of the bad. I have to be willing to let go of all those stories, because all they are is stories. So here's a couple ways to do that. A couple of techniques that you can put this into practice. Okay. So one way is to simply remember something that happened a very long time ago, in which you were an active participant. First time you fell in love, for example. Take something good. Don't take a frightening experience. Take something good. Time you got a big award, or you got a raise, or you got a promotion. You got something wonderful happen, and you go back and you bring up that memory, and you feel what that is. And now you just stop and say to yourself, pretend that's somebody else. Instead of you, pretend that's somebody else falling in love. Pretend that's somebody else getting the award. Pretend that's somebody else getting a promotion. Pretend you're watching a film, a movie. And in that movie, somebody's falling in love. In that movie, somebody's getting a raise. In that movie, somebody's getting a promotion. And as you do that, as you look at this event that took place in your own life years ago, what you start to realize is that you are no longer that person that was there. You carry a memory of it. You can make that memory vivid. You can recall it with sight and sound and smell and feeling and emotion and all of those things. But what you're remembering is not real. It's a story. It's a story that's going through your head. That's all it is. That's all it is. And then you say to yourself, well, if I'm not the one in the story who's falling in love or getting the raise or getting the promotion, then who am I? Who am I? And this is where we learn to be the observer, to be the witness. I mean, take the example that I gave you of a baby being born, and if you and I were standing there watching one of our children being born, and we watched them do all of this to the child, we might be very emotionally attached because this is our child, this is someone, this is a miracle coming into our family, but we're still observing. We're not the baby who's being twisted and turned all around and cleaned up and wrapped in swaddling clothes and all the things that they do to the child, Sometimes I watch the nurses handling newborn babies and I think, oh my, they're going to drop them, the way that they just grab them. Of course, they know what they're doing. But the difference between if you were the baby going through that and if you were just somebody watching a movie in which a baby had just been delivered, that's the difference I'm talking about. That's being the observer. So the first technique that you want to do is you want to try to deliberately think of your past experiences as a dream that you are awakening from, as a story, but that's all it is, a story. It may have some truth in it, may have some fabrication in it, may have some exaggeration in it, because that usually makes a story tell better. But nevertheless, a story. So we ask ourselves, well, who am I? This is interesting. If you go to like a meet and greet, a networking meet and greet for business, and the people are going around and introducing themselves, tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you? And immediately they start to say what they do. Of course, at a meet and greet, that's what you do. You want people to know what your business you're in, so you can maybe get some new clients. But of course, you're not what you do. You're not what you do for a living. They'll tell where they went to school. That's not who they are. That's where they went to school. They might say, well, they're from New York, but that's not who you are. That's just where you were born. Who are you? Who are you? So what you want to do in your own mind is take some time and ask yourself, who am I? Who am I? And when these answers that come up that are nothing but stories, say, no. It's just a dream. It's just a dream. It's just a story. That's not who I am. And of course that leaves the opening then, if none of that is, then who am I? See? Who am I? It creates the space in consciousness for a new awareness, a new reality, something perhaps closer to the truth, something moving you closer to the understanding of what your spiritual nature is. And the second thing that you can do, it's a meditation technique, and the second thing that you can do is pick an object, a person, a pet, a plant, pick an object that you're attached to, that you love, that you really, you really appreciate, you really enjoy. The example used in the meditation book I'm reading was a rose. How many times have we seen a rose and not really connected with it, not really related to it? We just kind of looked at it like an object, and maybe we'd say, well, gee, I wonder what kind of rose that is. I wonder if there's a name for that particular type of rose. I wonder what it smells like. But can we take an object, and your pets are great for this because they usually cooperate, a picture of your beloved, and can you focus on that object to the exclusion of everything else? In other words, let all of the other thoughts just kind of get softer and softer and softer and softer in the background, So maybe the TV's on, but now you don't hear it so much. And in a few minutes you hear it even less, in a few minutes less. And lawnmowers outside, airplanes overhead. And can you, to the best extent that you can you become one with this? Can you feel it? See? Can you sense it? Can you identify with it? Can you completely be absorbed in it? And while you're in that space, can you be aware of the fact of the presence of the object and the presence of your unification with it, and simultaneously with the absence of all else? I am aware that I am one. I am aware that I am experiencing the oneness. And I'm also aware that there's nothing else. There's nothing else. There's a void, there's an absence. And when you can bring yourself into that place where you can bring single-pointed meditation, if you want to call it that, you can bring your attention to one point and hold it there. But not just a visual, more than that. Can you connect to it? Can you sense it? Can you feel it? Can you try to imagine what it's like to be one with that object? Can you try to absorb it into yourself and you into it? Can you really get into this feeling of I am that, we are one kind of thing? And we do that to the exclusion of all else. And then what we're going to do is we're going to release that object as well. We are going to release that object as well. And just experience the absence. The absence. So what that does for us is we are so involved sometimes in our stories that we don't know how to let them go. And when we can learn how to focus on something else to the exclusion of all others, we have one way of ignoring our stories, of breaking our identification with our stories. And then we have a way of letting them go. A way of letting them go. So we kind of come down to this. As I mentioned the other week, conditioned consciousness. We kind of come into the world and we see things and we form opinions about them and we create stories about them, and this is good and that's not good, and this is tasty and that's not tasty, and all of these other things that are just largely spur of the moment, stories that we make up, kind of like impromptu speaking contest. They toss out a topic and you have to figure out something to say for a minute or two. We do that. We create these things. But now we have to let them go. Now we have to let them go. And when we let them go, then we are left with the adventure of discovering who I am. Who am I? What am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? I think it's important that we break our identification with our stories first, because if we don't do that, the answer that we will have to those questions will come out of those stories. What if the slate were wiped clean? What if none of what we have previously believed was there? Not that it was wrong, not that it was right, just that it wasn't there. What if, like a newborn babe coming into the world, we could start anew, discovering who we are? But this time, we would be aware of the fact that we are creating stories. We would be aware of the fact that our stories were not the truth. They were only our stories. What would we discover? What would we discover? In the East, they give us the example of looking for a jewel in a pond, and we've got our arm in the pond and we're moving it all around and we're splashing the water around and we're stirring up the mud, and we can't find the jewel because of all of the activity that we have created that has gotten in our own way. Our stories are like that. So when I was a kid, TV was kind of new, and a lot of the variety shows and comedians, they were kind of coming over from radio. And they had come to radio from vaudeville. So a lot of the jokes are very, very corny vaudeville jokes. And different comedians would tell the same jokes. The jokes were so old that nobody even knew who wrote them, I guess, and they would tell them over and over again. And the one joke that came up for me when I was thinking about this, your story. We get so caught up in our story that we don't know who we are. And the way that the joke goes, and I think the image that I have in my head is probably of Buddy Hackett Buddy Hackett doing it on Laugh-In. I think, I'm not sure, but I knew I had seen it years before. Maybe Henny Youngman did it on TV. Maybe Milton Berle did it on TV. And the setup is the man is walking down the street late at night, and he goes past an alley, and a robber comes out of the alley and points a gun at the man and says to him, "Give me your money or give me your life." And the man looks at the robber for a minute, and he says, "Well," he says, "you better take my life because I'm saving my money for my old age." And of course the robber has a puzzled look on his face. The fellow was so attached to his money. He was so attached to his money that he forfeited his life, or was willing to forfeit his life. And of course, you know, the joke's ridiculous because if he forfeited his life, he'd have no old age. And what I was thinking is, what if you and I were walking down the street and a robber stepped out of the alley and pointed a gun at us and said, "Your story or your life? Your story or your life?" How attached are you to the stories of your past, of your present, of yourself? Are you willing to let those stories dissolve? Can you break your identification with them so that you can find the jewel that is there waiting for discovery? Can we go with a Zen mind, with a beginner's mind? Can we be poor in spirit? For then we'll see God. I invite you this week to catch yourself telling your stories, catch yourself repeating your stories, catch yourself believing your stories, and stop right there and remind yourself it's only a dream. It's only a dream. Today I awaken. And so it is.